This is slide 3 in our Progressivism unit, Cities, States, and Women. Okay? So let's look at some of the work that's being done here, especially as we get down to a not quite a federal, but more a state and local level. Okay? And we will start our discussion with something called the political machines. Okay? Now these were, and both parties had them, Republicans and Democrats, but these were political parties that would fight for control of a city. Because once you had control of a city, you could make a lot of money illegally. Right? So this is really where a lot of the voter fraud comes in. You know, it seems like awfully expensive to pay everybody to go vote for you, but compared to how much money you can make illegally once you're in power, it's nothing. Okay? Oh, excuse me. We're going to talk about the most powerful of these political machines, and they get the nickname machines because they run as smoothly as a machine. It was the Democratic Party Tweed Ring. Right? The Tweed Ring. It's also sometimes known as the Tammany Ring because it ran out of Tammany Hall, was the city hall. But usually it's known as the Tweed Ring because of the man that ran it was called Boss Tweed. The guy who runs the political machine is known as the political boss. Okay? And Boss Tweed was the most powerful political boss in the country. Couple of reasons. One, he made more money illegally than anybody else. But two, it's New York City. It's the biggest city in the country, so if you control that, you're going to be extremely powerful. We're talking about a 6-7 year period here, going back a little bit, 1865 to 1871, 72, somewhere around there. You don't have to worry about the time. But that's how long these political machines have been around. And come early 1900s, they're still around. And the progressives are working to bring an end to them. So since Boss Tweed was the most powerful of the political bosses, let's talk a little bit about how he makes his money. And then you can understand how political machines in general work. The main way that political machines make their money is through something called a kickback. Okay? Now, the basic definition of kickback is overcharging the government for a service, and then you pocket the difference, the profits. You overcharge the government for a service, and then you pocket the difference. Okay? So let's say that you're going to provide a service to the government that should cost, $50,000, but you send the government a bill for $150,000. Boss Tweed pays the bill, so now you've made $100,000 extra dollars. You give most of that back to Boss Tweed. He lets you keep a little for your trouble. And Boss Tweed gets rich. And who got screwed? The taxpayers did, because they're the one overpaying for these things. If you remind me in class, we'll talk about some specifics, and I'll give you a specific example of kind of how this works to maybe make it a little more understandable. I know that's kind of obscure, but it's basically overcharging the government for a service and then pocketing the difference. Okay? Now, Boss Tweed, over the time he is in charge of New York City, will make almost $200 million illegally. Just profit, pure profit for himself. That's after he's paid off everybody he needs to pay off. Because you got to bribe a lot of people in order to do that. But Boss Tweed will personally make about $200 million for doing absolutely nothing over about a 6-7 year period. Right? He becomes extremely powerful, as you can imagine. He is brought down eventually by a man named Thomas Nast, N-A-S-T. Okay? Thomas Nast brings down the most powerful man in New York City and one of the most powerful in the country. You'd think Nast then must be pretty powerful himself. He's not. Thomas Nast was a political cartoonist. He drew political cartoons for newspapers and for magazines. Okay? Part of the way that political machines stay in power is by taking advantage of people. And their prime target, the people they most take advantage of, are immigrants. Okay? Immigrants would arrive in New York City, get off the boat, have nowhere to go, nothing to do, no money or anything, and there would be Boss Tweed's people, the members of his political machine, waiting to greet them and say, hey, welcome to America. You got a job? No, I don't have a job. Oh, well, we'll get you a job. You got anywhere to live? No. Well, we'll find you somewhere to live. You got any money? No. All right, well, we'll give you some money to get started. And they would take care of these immigrants. They do all these things for them. And then, come election time, the immigrants were expected to be loyal then and vote for Boss Tweed. It was great, right? So they would. Boss Tweed would get reelected, and then the immigrants would find themselves suddenly, once Boss Tweed is back into power, suddenly out of a job, out of their house, with nothing left. But by then, it didn't matter, because Boss Tweed had already started making new friends of the newer immigrants that had arrived. So this was just a cycle going on. Immigrants were constantly taken advantage of, mainly because they didn't know anything about voting, and they didn't know anything about their rights, and they hardly spoke the language, if at all. So they're easy targets for the political machines. Nast is able to appeal to the immigrants because he doesn't speak a language. Right? He uses his political cartoons to do his talking for him. So while all these newspaper reporters write these horrible stories about Boss Tweed, it doesn't matter because the immigrants can't read them anyway. But they do understand pictures, and pictures show up in the newspaper every day. Political cartoons bad-mouthing Boss Tweed about how rich he is and how great a life he's leading while these immigrants are struggling. So eventually, public opinion starts to turn against Boss Tweed. He flees the country. He's actually recognized in Europe, where he goes. He's recognized in Europe by Nast's political cartoons. He is arrested there and sent back to the U.S. to stand trial. And eventually Boss Tweed will go to jail and die in jail. So, the most powerful man in New York City is brought down by a cartoonist, of all things. Okay, more about how the progressives are fixing the problems in the country here. They propose using city commissions. Right? Now, a city commission is sort of the opposite of a mayor. Right? In a mayor system, a mayor makes all the decisions for the city. In a city commission system, there's a commission of, say, 15 people. Each of them has an area of expertise. One's an engineer, one's an architect, one's an accountant, one's a construction guy. Everything you're going to need to run a city. Right? The thinking is that it's harder to corrupt 15 people than one. It's easy for people like Boss Tweed to buy off the city mayor, to bribe him. It's harder to bribe 15 people than it is one. So you spread out the power, you get more people power, and that's the basic message of progressivism as we've been talking about. Now, where do the progressives get the idea for this? What are the models they're looking at? They're looking at Europe. Okay? Socialist governments in Europe are the models for how progressives want to rebuild city government. Okay? These city commissions and all of that. Europe is where they're looking at. Socialist governments in Europe. Now, at a state level, Wisconsin is the most progressive of all the states. Okay? Their governor is a man named Robert La Follette, known as Fighting Bob. And here you see a picture of Fighting Bob. There's Fighting Bob there. Fighting Bob La Follette. Very progressive governor. He uses the power of state government to take over a couple of industries that have monopolies in his state. Lumber industry for one, and in northern U.S. like Wisconsin, lumber is a big industry. He takes it over. Lets the government run it because the companies were taking advantage of the people. So Fighting Bob La Follette. He'll come back in our story later on, so remember that name. Okay. All right, and our last topic here, women in the progressive movement. We have said that most of the progressives are women, so they're going to accomplish a lot. Right? Their first work is in what are called settlement houses. Settlement houses. And the biggest of these, the most well-known, was in Chicago and called Hull House, Hull. You see it, the picture up at the top here. There's Hull House. And settlement houses were set up to help immigrants specifically, anybody who's poor, but mainly immigrants, adjust to life in America. They would help you get settled in your new country, your new state, your new city. Right? They would help teach you job skills. They would help teach you English. They would help you find a place to live. It was sort of a starting point, okay? But mainly worked with immigrants. Okay? Hull House was run by, or started by, Jane Addams. If you remember from our previous slide when we talked about feminism, one of the earliest feminists, Jane Addams, two D's, A-D-D-A-M-S, weird spelling, starts Hull House. Now, settlement houses mainly were run by women because it was considered women's work, okay? In a positive way, not a demeaning way. This is not, oh, that's women's work, men don't do it. But if you think about what needs done at the settlement house, it's things that women are good at because it's things that a mother is good at. You need to teach them language. You need to teach them how to read, how to write. You need to get them to cook meals, because we have different food here than where they came from. You teach them to cook in some cases. Teach them to keep house. These are, and care for children. Children came with the immigrants, so they had to be raised. So what the women do at the settlement house is what women are naturally good at. That's why women were mainly involved in these things. Okay? All right, another tale here about women's involvement, and this one's a very sad one. It involves a company called the Triangle Shirtwaist Company. Triangle Shirtwaist Company. A shirtwaist was an article of clothing for men. It's like a vest. The Triangle Shirtwaist Company was a textile company. They sewed clothes. Okay, so you would have a whole building full of women sewing clothing. Right? These were sweatshop conditions. Okay? Overcrowded workplace, incredibly hot, cloth lying around everywhere, scraps of clothing here and there and material. It's a fire trap, basically, and that's what happens. Okay? This was 1911, just to give you some time frame here. Okay? 1911, and I will show you a video on this in class to give you some more information on it. But basically, fire breaks out in the building. Women are trapped. They can't get out. 146 workers die. 146 workers die. Most of them young women working in sweatshop conditions. Okay? And the video we're going to watch will give you more information on that and kind of paint a picture of what it was like for you. Okay? Lastly here, we covered 3 amendments on the last slide, and I said we skipped one. It's because it shows up here. Anti-alcohol movements. Okay? Now we'll get into this in a lot more detail when we get into our 1920s unit and we talk about Prohibition, but the 18th Amendment is passed with the help of women. Okay? The 18th Amendment is Prohibition, and it will prohibit alcohol. It will outlaw alcohol. It makes illegal the making, the transportation, or the selling of alcohol. Okay? It's known as Prohibition. Okay? This is passed mainly by women's groups, and the most well-known of them, the biggest one of them, you see the logo right here, the WCTU, Women's Christian Temperance Union. The Women's Christian Temperance Union. It was the largest organization of women in the world. Okay, largest women's organization in the world. An anti-alcohol movement here in the country. The very famous picture here that comes out of this, lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours. And the comment usually is, well, looking at some of them, it's like, well, okay, I'll take the liquor. It's a horrible comment, but that's what you're thinking when you look at it, so let's just say it. Anyway, Prohibition will become law thanks to the work of women. Okay? States were the first to pass it, some of the laws, and then it becomes federal law. When in 1920, sorry, went blank there. When the 18th Amendment becomes law in 1920. Okay? All right, that will finish up our slides here as we moved from kind of federal to more state and local stuff. Next, you've been waiting for it, now it's here. We're going to talk about Mr. Rapp's hero, Teddy Roosevelt.